Humanitarian journalism.
8:40 exactly. Welcome back. Next guest is Hassen Lorgat. He is a member of the PSA, Palestine Solidarity Alliance, and we're going to get his insights on the Amnesty International report alleging that Israel is very definitely involved in crimes against humanity, and obviously it has also gone on to say that Israel is now an apartheid state. Hassen Lorgat, Assalamu alaikum, welcome to the program.
Walaikum salam, Julia, and thank you for having me.
Always a pleasure talking with you, and your response and PSA's response to the report by Amnesty International.
Yeah, Julia, I think in the 6-7 minutes or so that we have, we need to be careful that we can be drowned entirely by this information. They're not alleging that there's apartheid. They are merely confirming what others have done over the past few decades and years. And I think part of the issue that I want to raise in this discussion is that we jump, and rightly so, we are pleased when an NGO, because that's where I work, comes up and speaks truth to power. But oftentimes we ignore that the people that they speak about have said these things themselves, right? So I think often we ignore that Palestinians were the first to say they're living under a settler colonial apartheid state. There's one of the top intellectuals who formed the Palestine Research Center in Beirut, right? Faiz Sayegh. He, already in the 70s, began to state that Israel is an apartheid state and they're harming Palestinians. Uri Davis, whom the MRN brought to this country in the 80s, indicated this is so. But the United Nations, for example, had their first conference around the situation in Palestine, the first seminar in 1980. So when Amnesty resolves that the United Nations must do certain things, the Israeli state must respect the law, they're merely repeating things that others have said. The question I want to ask, Julie, because we've had a string of these, right? Edward Said, for example, in the 90s wrote, "How do you spell apartheid?" Then he said, OSLO, Oslo. Jimmy Carter in 2006, right? He published as a president, Palestine, peace, not apartheid. And they gave him flack, right? And then, of course, we also had our own HSRC, right? Virginia Tilley and others publishing a report on Israel. Then you had Human Rights Watch, B'Tselem, and Amnesty International. The question is really, they are repeating the story. This is an apartheid state. And they do not state how do we dismantle it. They say the United Nations must do something. They say that the powerful countries in the Security Council must do something. Nothing happens. Well, how do we keep Israel accountable is the question that I think they're beginning to address, but not forcefully enough.
Okay, Hassan, I think you've raised the most important question, and that is, in fact, I put this question to Amnesty International when I spoke to them a few days ago on the show, I think 2 days ago. And I said, but are you not stating the obvious? We've known from the beginning of time that this is an apartheid state. That's the very question I put to them. You've just supposedly now legitimized the fact that Israel is an apartheid state. And you've just made the most important statement there by saying, where and how do we move forward? How is Israel or the Zionists going to be held accountable for these crimes against humanity? What's happening in Israel is definitely a genocide. So how do we move forward? Up to now, the world powers have done absolutely nothing as far as the fate of the Palestinian people is concerned. What is going to change, or what has changed as far as this report is concerned?
Julie, I'm caught between and betwixt, in that it's right that the world opinion is going against this entity. And that way, it is tightening the noose as much as it did under apartheid. But what was the critical elements in our fight for justice here? The banks in the US, the financial system decided they're not going to invest and support this regime, right? It's a very, very critical turning point. When money was not coming into this country, while we were putting pressure from below, it made the regime sit down and talk. The American government continues to sponsor the Israeli state with millions every year, every month of dollars, propping it up. And the governments in Europe, under pressure from their own citizenry to be more just, have been siding with the elites in Israel and the Zionist state. You know, so we need to keep this pressure up. We need to keep it up in all our countries. The American activists there are putting pressure in the states. The military aid they give to Israeli impunity is unfathomable that they can do this. If it's any other country, they would say there's a violation of human rights. But every time Israel gets a report like this, they hurl abuse against the people. They'll say it is anti-Semitic. They go through the usual tactics of trying to rubbish it. But the Israeli journalists, uh, um, Gideon Levy said yesterday, the world will continue to hurl the invective. Israel will continue to ignore it. The world will say apartheid. Israel will say anti-Semitism. But the evidence will keep piling up. What is written in the report does not stem from anti-Semitism, but will help strengthen it. Israel is the greatest motivator of anti-Semitism urges in the world today. This is from a Jewish progressive journalist in Haaretz. So the point is, the pressure is coming to them. All the old tactics of trying to stop people from talking truth to power uh, is not working anymore. They are more and more vulnerable. I mean, when this report, Amnesty apparently was sitting on this report for about a year because of flack that they were getting in the political, in the society, in the media, putting pressure on them not to publish it. So Israel is feeling it. But the recommendations that the report makes, we need to try and indigenize them. We've got to bring them home. We've got to say, what does the South African government do, right? The report makes a lot of noise about affirming the Convention on Apartheid. The Security Council must do certain things. It says a lot of things like that, right? And we must ask our government, why is it that we are operating with the state as if it is business as usual? As we continue, every day the land is fragmented, pieces of land is stolen, people are shot, the indignity at the checkpoints continue. We've got to do much more than that.
Okay, we do know that over the past few days, a family in East Jerusalem are taking the Israelis to the ICC because their home was demolished. And I think this family of 14, a couple of the family members were injured in that terrible, horrendous upheaval. Amnesty International are also saying that it's time that these atrocities are taken to the ICC. Do you think that that will happen, that will become a reality for the many displaced families in, the Palestinians? And then, because of time constraints, very quickly, you mentioned Virginia Tilley. A long time ago, she wrote a book regarding the two-state solution. Could that be the answer? If you could respond to those two questions before we wrap up.
Julie, I mean, it's very, very clear that Edward Said and others have found out, have argued a long time ago that you cannot have what they've done now. They've changed the demographics so fundamentally that we cannot have the state that we have. The two-state is a non-starter. But I want to go back to one of the great philosophers in the German line of struggle, Karl Marx, who says, philosophers have hitherto only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it. Now we've had all these studies The challenge is how can we put them into action? The UN Security Council are supposed to impose targeted sanctions. Will the Americans comply? So it's those power dynamics, but we must continue to fight there.
Hassan, that's where we leave it. Always wonderful talking to you. You have such deep insight into these issues, but inshallah, we will hook up again soon. Thank you indeed for your time. Hassen Lorgat from the PSA giving us his reflections on the latest report or the report by Amnesty International regarding, obviously, they are saying that Israel is an apartheid state. So we will be following this up sometime soon. 8:50 exactly. News and views right here on Salam Media.